So much going on this morning, so much. And this sermon series, of which today is the 6th part, next week the 7th part will end it, began in Women's History Month, and we were inspired as we were planning the worship to be sure and incorporate as much feminine imagery as we could, not only from Bible stories, but also in reference to the Godhead. So we've shaken you up a little bit. We've made you think in some new ways. There is a reading of the prayer of our Savior that is yet to come that is going to feel a little different. I say that to you now because we've had guests for the last 5 Sundays, and it's been important for me afterwards to say we're doing this as a way of challenging ourselves and of helping us to think in new ways about who God is and about God's activity among us. Furthermore, this morning we are talking about Mary, Mary of Nazareth, who is one of 5 Marys who were at the table of the Last Supper, from what we can tell, and who will be voiced by Andrea on Thursday evening. For Maundy Thursday, we encourage you to be here for that, as we have 10 women who were at the Last Supper talking with each other about their experiences in that group and with Jesus himself. And finally, there's Good Friday, in which again Andrea will be reprising the role of Mary of Nazareth as we hear from women of the Bible talking about their experiences at the cross of Jesus. This is going to be a wonderful and fitting drawing to a close of the season of Lent, as we have been meditating upon and bearing in mind the work and the witness of some of the most powerful women in human history. I say all of that, and note that if you can't make it on Thursday or Friday, you still have the Jesus window shining down on you. 1923, they put 11 women around Jesus as he preaches the Sermon on the Mount. And we are brought again to understand the critical role of women in the early church. So I came to realize as I was composing this sermon that Mary of Nazareth is just about my favorite biblical character. This is because she is so complex and invites us into thinking that is genuinely complex, sometimes contradictory, sometimes mysterious, but always, I think, somewhat problematic in our embrace of this faith which we all share. She is possibly more complex herself than even her son, Jesus. I'm completely serious. I will address this complexity today by examining 3 different facets of her personality. A personality which I admit is the stuff of legend as well as the stuff of history, but you'll sometimes find me mixing those 2 together, and I want to say, because of the way in which we have received our faith, this is just the way I've come to know her. So the first facet is the role that Mary has played in the history of the church as a legend herself, as a tradition, as a person. She is the one without whom our understanding of salvation would not exist. Our comprehension, our embrace of salvation is entirely dependent upon Mary in Christianity. Are you hearing me? She literally gave birth to our salvation. But she also did this in a very poetic fashion, and so we're going to deal somewhat with that. Mary of Nazareth also is a model of piety for us, even for us of this church in particular, in as much as she survived the death of her adult son, which is not an uncommon experience among us in this community. And I will conclude by concerning us with the matter of her son's birth. A problematic pregnancy, if ever there was one. We have to talk about this from our growingly egalitarian and equitable point of view in our society, which still, I admit, has a long way to go. So, Mary is the mother of salvation, literally and poetically. She is a model of piety, and we need to face the challenge of her pregnancy. Rosemary Radford Ruether, who in addition to her seminal and classic 1983 work, Feminism and God Talk, in 1977 composed a little volume of lectures she called Mary, the Feminine Face of the Church. Some of you may know that Professor Radford Ruether started her theological career as a Catholic, but followed a line of thinking we now call liberation theology, and eventually knew it would be necessary for her to depart the Catholic Church because she would be unable to teach in their institutions, because she was unable to bear the patriarchy she encountered there. In Mary, Feminine Face of the Church, Professor Radford Ruether offers not only a critique of the Catholic veneration of Mary, but also a critique of the Protestant dismissiveness toward Mary. In Protestantism, we have assumed that anything written about Mary is, as Professor Ruether puts it, primarily teaching about Jesus Christ. Anything we say about Mary among Protestants historically has really been a teaching about Jesus Christ. Further, she says, in traditions that have historically revered Mary, such as the Catholic and the Orthodox, she tends to be used as a means for rendering women passive. So, among Protestants, she is ignored, while among others, Mary is a device of the patriarchy for oppressing the very women her spirit would prefer to liberate. Either way, we are not getting her full effect. This difficulty with Mary is not limited to the church, but is just as visible in the Gospels. I promise you. Go to the Gospel according to Mark. Mary is never referred to by name. She is always his mother, and Mark really resents that when Jesus went to Nazareth for the first time after he began preaching, she and his brothers came in order to take him away because they said he has a demon. Mark's very upset with her about that. Further, there is this Gospel of John. In John, Mary's name is not mentioned either. She's always Jesus' mother. But there, it's a veneration because of how it is that she has been willing to part with her adult son and to take on a new son. Matthew and Luke both use her name, and while Matthew states her name at the beginning of the gospel, telling the story of Jesus' birth through Joseph's perspective, it nevertheless is a perspective of a man rather than of a woman. Only Luke speaks of Mary as being someone to emulate, to venerate, but in ways that are recognizing her humanity. Luke equates Mary with the prophet Hannah and with the mother of Samson. Luke does this because, as far as that author is concerned, Mary brought to life the begotten child of God. Jesus, who embodied our salvation, had Mary as his mother. The first two chapters of Luke are dedicated to affirming this very thing. After the familiar story you and I all know of Mary and Gabriel's message, which I will return to Later, the old man Simeon at the door of the temple not only blesses the Holy Family, but warns Mary, "And a sword shall pierce your own heart too." Mary, unintimidated by her task of rearing God's own child, nevertheless loses track of Jesus at the temple sometime in his adolescence, and she takes him to task for staying behind. "Why have you treated us like this?" she asks. "We were worried." Jesus gives a reply so sarcastic and dismissive that one imagines that he was indeed a 12-year-old responding. "Why were you searching? Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" Thank God that Mary was the mother of salvation and not me. I perceive in my own heart that to have been that boy's parent, I would have ruined our hope for salvation in that moment. "Blessed are you among women," Gabriel declared knowingly. "And a sword shall pierce your own soul too," Simeon said. And let's be honest, these two qualities are what it means for anyone to bring forth and experience salvation, which is both joyous and painful. The resulting piety, her expression of faith, is an equally curious blend of revolution and reverence. As a single woman, or possibly as a single girl who's simply menstruating, Mary learns of her pregnancy, and in Luke, anyway, sings a song of victory. She bears more than a vague resemblance to Hagar, who accepted her fate of servitude and naming the God who had ensured that she would remain a slave. Hagar, in being told, "Go back to your master and your mistress," replies to the one who tells her so, "You are the God who sees." As if to say, "I'm going to hold you to that promise of blessing you gave me just a moment ago." Mary said in response to God's statement, "You are going to bear my child, all generations will call me blessed." Mary may be the mother of our salvation, even the mother of salvation generally, but this salvation is not liberty in the sense that we encounter it. No. Mary understands that she's going to have to live as a slave of God. Strangely, Mary is victorious in this, and the meaning of her name and the name of so many mothers of the church rings clear as a bell when she does. The origin of her name, Mary, is Miriam, which is the name of Moses' sister. Miriam means rebellious and has the same Hebrew word root as the word bitter, Mara, which you'll remember is what Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi insisted that others should call her after her husband and sons died in a very short span of time. Bitter, rebellious. Parenthood and nurture have become synonyms with piety in Mary, but not conventional parenthood and nurture. In the Magnificat, which Andrea read earlier, Mary's parenthood and nurture arise in a revolutionary sense. She has experienced the interruption of human oppression with divine victory. And her acceptance of pregnancy is an audible, visible, sensible representation of that victory. Let me characterize for you how troublesome her sense of victory would have been, and yet how it was still valid. In Jewish diatribes against the upstart Christian sect, Mary is said to have been raped by a Roman soldier. And his heritage and Jesus' heritage and parentage, therefore, are suspect. Mary, envisioning in a song the overthrow of an oppressive colonial power, has quite a different ring to it from this vantage point. Her perception of herself as a slave of God has a much darker ring to it, but this interpretation and understanding of Mary, of the victim snatching agency from out of her oppressor's hands by God's grace, causes her in the Magnificat to picture a future thanks to her own enslavement and her child's assault on tyranny, which is unremittingly just, genuinely loving, and abidingly kind. This is parenthood that is an act of insurrection. Parenthood that is potent with a defiant joy. This is what parenting can mean among enslaved and colonized peoples, those who know that they are destined for earthly freedom one day and bound for glory eternally now. Will Gaffney inserts this in understanding into her translation of the Magnificat, which we heard read just a moment ago. There, Mary is not just a slave, because in Hebrew or Aramaic there is no distinction between servants and slaves, even though we have grown accustomed to Mary saying, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord." Mary is no servant, voluntarily serving by accepting the divine pregnancy. Mary has no choice in this matter. She is God's womb slave, owned completely and without any alternative, the way that Hagar and Zilpah and Bilhah and so many others were. Mary's fate indeed was not her choice. Whether she was raped by a Roman, lovingly but prematurely conjugal with Joseph, or impregnated by God, there can be no doubt, as the story is told, that her conception of Jesus was unplanned. And how many cases today of pregnancy are just the same? We can rationalize their situations by optimistically speaking of these girls and women as vessels of life, but the passivity of the word vessel, in its meaning as receptacle or container, is not mitigated by the positivity of life. A vessel remains passive. Mary was anything but passive. According to our legend and traditions, she claimed agency in her enslavement. She had the audacity to scold God when she thought she'd lost Jesus in the temple. "Why have you treated us like this? We were worried." And by most accounts, she traveled with Jesus. In John, she grieved her son's dying at the foot of the cross, and she went to claim his body as soon as it was possible afterward. She was anything but passive. If Mary demonstrates anything to us, it is the critical importance of feminine integrity, of personal integrity, of being who we are regardless of how others will see us. And she indicates to us who are already confident about our personal identities our vital obligation to establish equity for others who are oppressed because of their identities. It is not a great leap of understanding to draw from her example that we must affirm ourselves and one another, especially the non-binary and genderqueer. We must condemn efforts at oppression parading as protecting children. On the Sunday after Ketanji Brown Jackson was confirmed to become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of our land, the importance of claiming one's own integrity and of assuring it for others is undeniable. We are not enslaved to this world. Christ's cross ensures that. And Mary of Nazareth sang of it from the very moment of that child's conception in her, however problematic that may have been. We witness with her the upheaval of earthly power in the revolution of the divine. In other words, in Mary we witness the motherhood of salvation. On this Sunday, celebrating our great rabbi's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, let us be busy about the overthrow of abuse, the overthrow of cruelty, of terror, and of fear. Let us be immediately about the work toward a reign of kindness, righteousness, compassion, and love, and outright joy, even in the midst of bittersweetness. Mary of Nazareth, Jesus' mother, has shown us salvation, modeled piety, and done all of it in the ironic depth of humanness. And so we can, and so we will do.